This is not a story of honor or triumph. It is a ledger of cruelty written on sand. In the center of Rome's arenas, men were turned into lessons, their lives measured by how much pain the crowd could stomach. If you look closely, what you witness is how an empire made suffering into spectacle. The sun bakes the stones until they sing. The stands are a faceless hum of appetite. When a trumpet screams, the hush cracks and a shape becomes the point of every eye. I want you to imagine not just the clash of steel, but the theater of torment that unfolded behind the gladiators' helmets and the gladiators who were instruments as much as fighters. They came from farms and prisons and foreign coasts. Some were trained to dance with death, others dragged from chains and given a moment to make sense of a sentence already written. The crowd demanded drama, and the men in the sand were invited to supply it. Emperors and magistrates watched the same way, weighing how each display fed the city's appetite for order, for fear, for spectacle. And so inventiveness, cruel, precise, bureaucratic, found an audience. What could be devised to make someone tremble and confess? To make an animal of a person, and then amuse the masses? The answer grew in the glare of torches and the clink of coin. Not all torment was hidden behind battle lines. There were mock plays where the condemned were dressed as mythic villains and made to relive punishment for stories everyone already knew. They called them pennae, rehearsals of fate where actors and audience agreed on the moral and the price was flesh. Sometimes the stage was a mock ship where men were lashed and tossed into a shallow pool of water, while crowd-side actors mimed sinking, an enactment of drowning, meant to terrify as much as to punish. At other times, men were made to stand before the beasts, it's not as equals but as bait, their wrists bound while the animals were urged forward until the first cry. Yet cruelty also had its bureaucratic brand. Laws specified certain kinds of death as suitable for certain crimes. And magistrates delighted in the artistry of matching method to offense. The cruelty was not random, it was deliberate and wrapped in ceremony. Processions, heralds, and the sudden hush that falls when a life is formally declared forfeit. People came to the arena not only to see combat, but to see lines drawn between citizen and criminal, human and other. Among the most feared spectacles were those that turned the gladiator against himself, contests designed not to test skill but endurance, contests where survival was not measured by winning a match, but by surviving a sentence. They could be forced to run gauntlets of blows until their bodies refused the effort to rise. They could be tied and prodded, while ropes cut into their skin until they learned the lesson of submission. Sometimes men were made to kneel and witness other men suffer first, taught in the most immediate way that fate could be rotated and that everyone's turn might come. These were lessons in terror that tricked the mind. After hours of quiet punishment, the smallest sound could feel like thunder. The crowd loved this slow cruelty because it extended the drama and offered everyone a role. The jury, the executioner, the merciful spectator who asked for a reprieve that was seldom granted. It transformed pain into a shared commodity, something to be bought with shouts and with the tossing of coins. There were tricks of humiliation, too, designed to strip a man of dignity before his body was taken from him. Prisoners might be forced to wear the garments of their enemies, to be paraded in chain and mockery through a sea of shouting faces. Some were made to carry effigies of the gods they had offended, dragged in a procession that mocked both prayer and punishment. Public spectacles relied on the theater of shame, a man's name, his origin, his misdeeds, all called out loud so everyone could place him, not only as a body in the sand but as the sum of accusations that had condemned him. Those who survived such public shaming returned to private lives permanently altered. Those who did not die only in body. The purpose was social calibration, a lesson to the city about who could be pushed and how far, a demonstration that power held both the right and the appetite to humiliate. At times, the empire sought to combine spectacle with instruction. Executions were staged with a moral flourish, a kind of public sermon in which cruelty functioned as cautionary tale. Officials used the arena to show what happens to perjury, to brigands, to those who challenged property or the state. The apparatus of law fed the apparatus of show. A judge's sentence would be amplified by the pageantry of the arena, the thunder of the crowd confirming judgment. This made the arena an instrument of governance as much as entertainment. The more visible the punishment, the clearer the message. People spoke of justice and order, but what they cheered for was the moment when individual flesh confirmed the collective will. In that confirmation, the city found comfort. In the spectacle, it found consensus. Yet within that system of formal cruelty, there grew darker games played by the more imaginative. Gladiators themselves, who trained to kill and to survive, sometimes became the architects of torment for others. Some men, expert with a whip or a blade, were set to teach captives the limits of pain. They practiced on the condemned, sharpening both tools and reputations. The crowds mistook this as part of the entertainment, but for those on the receiving end, it was a kind of apprenticeship in terror. A lesson in what the human body could take and how the spirit bent. These lessons were not always immediate deaths. Many were designed to last, to be retold by survivors who could not forget. And those survivors, when released, carried a language of fear that traveled home. Families learned not from laws, but from the scars and silences of their returning men. Rome's far reaches were policed by story as much as law. The instruments themselves were chosen like props, each one with an intended story. There were tools that cut, tools that burned, tools that bruised with slow repetition. Chains of iron, racks that stretched, spits that turned until muscle cried, all had their place. Many instruments aimed to prolong rather than speed death, to make every second a horizon of dread. But the most haunting devices were the ones that toyed with hope. A prisoner lifted, offered water, only to be mocked and denied. Or a man made to stand in the center with a moment where the emperor could glance and decide between mercy and spectacle. Those withheld mercies were a currency. A nod from the top could change a life. And often the crowd's noise swayed the power toward spectacle. In such moments, the arena was a mirror held up to the city. If a nation could be swayed by spectacle, what did that say about the society that produced it? Not all gladiators were equal in these performances. Some were celebrated, adorned, and fed with favor. Others were treated like raw material. The celebrated fought with style, and were sometimes spared from the worst torments. Their value to the manager and the crowd protecting them. Those without fame, captured rebels, accused criminals, slaves sold without story, were the true material of torture. Their anonymity made them perfect for the most inventive cruelties, because no one would ask too many questions about their past. The empire could be very economical. Let one nameless body be the canvas upon which lessons are painted. By contrast, the famous gladiator's suffering could be staged as a near tragedy, as a display of valor. The crowd loved that tension, the illusion that courage might bend the line between life and death. For all of this cold calculation, there were moments of raw, confusing compassion among the crowd. On rare days, a shout would rise, not to demand a harsher fate, but to beg for a life. A gesture from the emperor could turn that tide. A plea from a wife in the stands could cut through the ritual. These moments were hurried and fragile. The way light through prison bars is fragile, but they existed and they mattered to those who lived through them. Yet the machinery of spectacle was designed to swallow those tender sparks. Mercy, when given, became another form of drama. The city would applaud it. As if to say, we can be kind, and look how grand we are for it. In the end, such gestures rarely changed the fundamental design of the system. They only let it breathe for a moment. The psychological toll on those who watched, as well as those who suffered, cannot be measured easily. Children raised on the games learned how to condense pity into a shout. Men of office practiced their faces because judgment required a certain expression. The city learned to trade empathy for entertainment, to equate the cooling of a shout with good order. And that trade was its own slow violence. A society that applauded pain, eroded trust, made cruelty normal, and taught that the sharp edge of spectacle could always come back to any neck. There were those who tried to resist. Philosophers and poets who wrote against the shows. Mothers who kept children away. Men who refused to be called to service. Yet resistance was a small current against a sea of appetite. When the day ended and the stands emptied, the arena remained a place that had been stretched taut by human contradiction. The sand soaked up the steps of those who had moved with courage and those who had moved under command. In the quiet, the keepers swept, taking away the traces the crowd would not see. But no broom could sweep away the lessons taught, the household conversations that would follow, or the fears that would reshuffle futures. Survivors carried with them memories that did not fit neatly into praise or condemnation. They returned as men who had watched and been watched, who had learned that life could be negotiated by others. Some found ways to reweave their identities, turning pain into a tale of endurance to be told by firelight. Others were broken in ways that had no language left but silence. This is not merely a catalog of cruelty. It is a study of how spectacle changes a city, how punishment becomes pedagogy, and how human bodies become the instruments of public lessons. The arena was a place where lines were drawn in the name of order, but those lines cut deeper than statute. It taught people what they might demand from power and what power might demand in return. And when we imagine the echo of those stones today, we must reckon not only with the men in chains and those with the reins of authority, but with ourselves. With the way any culture might be tempted to look at suffering less as a tragedy than as a lesson. After the sand cooled, the lesson did not end. Survivors carried the arena's education into homes, taverns, and distant farms. This is how the spectacle seeped into ordinary life, and how it bent men and women in ways laws could not. Those who left the arena lived under a new grammar of fear and bargaining. They learned small practical rules. Where to walk so a magistrate would not notice. Which words to avoid at market. How to fold a plea into a laugh, so it would slide past a watchful eye. A man who had stood in the center learned quickly that survival often depended on the economy of obviousness. To appear useful, to look unremarkable, to never draw the kind of attention that made a crowd hungry for spectacle. Families of survivors caught this lesson secondhand. Wives and sons listened to stories that were more warning than memory, tales that began with a name and then became a list of behaviors to adopt. Children learned to lower their voices when speaking of certain men. Elders taught gestures that meant don't ask or change the subject. In this slow social schooling, the arena multiplied itself, its methods passed on quietly, its customs and habits, until no one could remember when they hadn't existed. The trainers and managers who profited from the games also adapted. Ludier, the fighting schools grew more sophisticated because the city asked them to be. Wealthy patrons wanted novelty, and the costs of novelty were paid in bodies in rehearsed cruelty. New spectacles required new preparations. Landscapes built in the sand, animals imported from farther reaches, costumes fancier and punishments more theatrical. The business side of blood became a complex web of contracts and favors. Managers traded information with officials. A senator's protege might be enrolled as part of a show and spared the worst, while an obscure captive might be signed to a contract guaranteeing a performance length that was meant to shame and not kill outright. The economics of the arena made certain lives profitable and others expendable. That distinction hardened into policy and then into practice, changing how people valued life itself. Even the architecture of the city bore the arena's imprint. Shops that catered to viewers sprang up near the amphitheaters. Garlands, sacrificial props, trays of food that could be eaten between battles. Street sellers hawked talismans and charms promising protection from the fate that the sand represented. Sculptors carved commemorative reliefs that celebrated not only victories, but particular moments of mercy or cruelty, turning them into civic memory. The visual language of the games, the emblem of the trident, the net, the helmeted face, became a kind of popular shorthand, used in graffiti and in the signs above inns. In these small ways, the spectacle entered the fabric of daily life and made cruelty familiar enough that few people questioned it often. It felt normal because the city had trained itself to accept it as necessary. Philosophers and moralists did not stop their complaints, but they faced a crowd that wanted sensation more than doctrine. Some wrote elegant condemnations, arguing that a society that took joy in another's pain had rotted on its core. Others tried quieter work. Private schools that taught children empathy through stories. Poets whose verses slipped between lines to show the cost of spectacle. These voices mattered to a few and occasionally to many, but they rarely changed policy. What shifted behavior more often were the small, human acts of empathy that caught on. A widow's plea saved a man. A child's sob softened an emperor's mood. A wealthy patron offered sanctuary to a survivor whose story moved him. These acts were never the rule. They were the exceptions that reminded the city it could be otherwise. But exceptions at times gather force and become new expectations, and so resistance to spectacle grew in tiny but meaningful ways. Religion also began to braid into the conversation. Not just the old state rites, but new creeds whose followers drew lines around cruelty. Some cults emphasized mercy as a civic good. Others promised salvation to those who suffered unjustly. In the quiet of homes and in whispered prayers at shrines, people began to mark the arena's victims as something more than stage props. Mourning practices adapted. Families who had once been expected to accept fate now arranged rites that declared value beyond the crowd's judgment. Where the state used the arena to name someone a cautionary tale, religion sometimes reclaimed that person as a soul with dignity. That reclaiming was slow and partial, but it created spaces where applause did not have to be the last word. At the edges of the empire, the lessons of the sand traveled in rougher forms. Merchants carried stories to ports in far provinces. Soldiers returned from campaigns with tales that mixed local customs with Roman spectacle. In those margins, the game's methods mutated, mixed with local punishments, adapted into new performances, or outright rejected. In some places, the arena's example hardened into systems of policing that used public pain to keep order. In others, foreign customs provided counterexamples that made Roman citizens wonder whether their ways were inevitable. Those conversations shaped law and habit in subtle ways. Governors who wanted to project strength sometimes staged harsher punishments to impress distant subjects. Others, worried about unrest, limited the worst excesses, guiding their provinces toward a different balance between order and cruelty. Inside the schools, the men who taught and fought were constantly negotiating their identities. A gladiator might be both performer and prisoner, trained to be adored and to be disposable. Some tried to turn that contradiction into leverage. They cultivated public favor, staged small rebellions of dignity, demanded favors that would buy them a pension or a plot of land. Others surrendered to the system, becoming efficient instruments of whatever the crowd demanded that day. Those who survived long enough sometimes found a curious power. Reputation could protect. A man famous for a thrilling fight could start to choose his roles. A favorite could be spared a publicly humiliating punishment because his name was a commodity. But that power was brittle. Fame could vanish with a single rumor. A misstep in a show might end a career. The tension between agency and instrumentality defined lives in ways that no law could easily untangle. And then there were the stories, the oral histories that stitched people together. Men and women who had been in the sand told tales that did more than recount events. They taught how to live afterward, around hearths and taverns, in the small dark rooms where trades were discussed. These stories were repeated and adjusted. Each retelling shaped memory. A moment of mercy became a parable about the virtues of pleading at the right time. A botched execution became a cautionary note about trusting strangers. Over years, these stories formed a counter-history to the official records. One that recorded nuances and small mercies official chroniclers ignored. These narratives became social tools. They helped communities decide whom to trust and how to act when power threatened to make spectacle of their neighbors. Toward the end of many careers, some survivors found a strange peace in telling and retelling. Words became a balm. They learned to tell their stories not just as warnings, but as ways to regain authorship of traumatic events. They practiced telling details that emphasized humor or irony, distractions that let listeners approach without flinching. In doing so, they transformed the past from a raw wound into a memory shaped by choice. This was not denial. It was a strategy of survival. It allowed entire generations to carry the arena's lessons, while reminding themselves it did not define every part of life. They found ways to reintegrate, to care for children, to marry, to work. The arena's imprint remained, but so did the human urge to repair and to make meaning. So the story of the sand did not stop where the last trumpet did. It threaded into markets, into law, into the architecture of neighborhoods, and the rhythm of daily conversation. It shaped how men moved and how children learned to watch. It created jobs and reputations and a shadow economy that fed on spectacle. Yet at the same time, it sparked small resistances, forms of mercy, and reinventions of memory. The arena taught the city many things, but the people who lived alongside it taught the city back, sometimes with silence, sometimes with pleading, sometimes with acts of subtle refusal. In that ongoing exchange, the true power of the spectacle was revealed, not only in its ability to inflict pain, but in its capacity to be questioned and slowly to be reshaped. When the next season opened, nothing about the sand had truly changed, and yet everything was different for those who had learned to read its lessons. The same drums called people to seats. The same banners flew. The same men marched out under the eyes of magistrates. Yet behind the fanfare, small shifts were happening, almost imperceptible, unless you knew where to look. A lanista adjusted his roster not only for skill, but for stories, who could draw pity, who could anger, who could be paraded as a living example of mercy, denied or granted. A few senators, hearing too many whispers from the provinces, began to measure applause against unrest and found the calculus less predictable than they had assumed. Priests, counting offerings, noticed families bringing different votive gifts. Mothers whispered different prayers. The city's pulse altered in tiny beats, and those beats were enough to change the choreography of cruelty over time. Out beyond the largest arenas, in the narrow streets, and the guest rooms behind taverns, new conversations took root. Survivors who had bent towards silence now practiced the harder work of naming what had been done to them, and of claiming reasons that did not include shame. Tradesmen who once boasted about the day's best show found their voices quieter. When a neighbor's child sobbed through a retelling, small groups gathered, not to plan revolution but to teach one another the art of ordinary living after extraordinary harm. They made lists of things to do if a magistrate came by, rehearsed how to cover a wound so it did not invite comment, and taught children that not every spectacle deserved applause. Those circles were modest and private, but they worked like slow mortar, strengthening social bonds that spectacles sought to crack. At the level of law, pushback took forms that were both principled and practical. Advocates argued that public punishments, far from deterring crime, often created more crime by celebrating cruelty and making victims of the wrong people. Others framed the issue in economic terms. When entire professions rose and fell on the appetite for blood, the city's markets bent abnormally, and instability followed. Some magistrates, responsive to these arguments, or merely to the murmurs of a restive populace, experimented with limits. They shortened shows, forbade certain forms of cruelty from appearing as entertainment, or demanded better record-keeping about who was brought to the sand and why. These changes were piecemeal and uneven, different across neighborhoods and provinces, but each one carved space for new norms. Over years, those norms accumulated into pressure that even the most conservative managers could not entirely ignore. The personal stories of transformation were more complicated. Not every gladiator sought a quiet life afterward, and not every survivor found healing. Some turned the memory of the arena into craft, a former fighter who took to carving small wooden helmets for children, or a woman who opened a modest school where she taught reading and also the rhetoric of pleading in public. Others became fierce critics, traveling from market to market to tell cautionary tales that mixed detail with drama. They made living by turning trauma into warning. And some people never stopped being haunted. They drank. They left families. They became the very figures they had once despised. The city held all of these fates, sometimes in the same house, and the moral landscape grew richer and more fraught as a result. The arc of a life that had touched the sand could bend toward charity or toward bitterness. And communities learned to hold both possibilities without pretending the choices were easy. Resistance also took less visible forms. A baker might refuse to stamp loaves with an emblem, celebrating an execution. A sculptor might carve a relief that emphasized sorrow rather than triumph. A troupe of actors might stage a play that made audiences uncomfortable by showing the private cost of public cruelty. These small acts accumulated like drops that eventually hollowed stone. Young men in the schools began to ask different questions of their teachers about honor and service. Some owners of fighting schools found they could no longer fill their best rings with eager spectators unless they softened certain cruelties. Novelty had a limit when it collided with conscience. And in a handful of provinces, local governors banned some more barbaric displays outright after unrest. Not always for moral reasons. Sometimes to prevent rebellion, but their decrees had moral consequence just the same. In time, the literature of the city recorded these shifts. Poets and playwrights stopped merely celebrating the victor and started to circle the shadow at the edge of each tale, the face of the one who had been spared, or the whisper of a mother who watched her son become a lesson. Court speeches recorded debates about the function of punishment and the dangers of spectacle. Philosophers sharpened their arguments about empathy, and those arguments found audiences beyond the elite schools. Letters crossed the sea describing policies that had been tried and the results they had produced. Provincial magistrates learned from one another and adapted. The change was not sudden, and it was never complete, but it was real enough that a child born into the same city as the first chapter of our story would know a world subtly different. A world where public cruelty remained possible, but where it was more frequently questioned, where mercy sometimes arrived more reliably, and where survivors could hope for some recognition beyond the gasps of a crowd. The most important lesson that spread unevenly, stubbornly, was that people could shape the meaning of their institutions. Where once the arena set the lesson, now 1,000 small acts and laws and stories pushed back, insisting that there were other ways to teach order than by turning flesh into spectacle that did not erase the past. The sand still soaked up blood, and the stones still echoed with old cruelties. But what had been presented as inevitable began to look like a choice that could be made otherwise. And because choices multiply, they altered how new generations understood power and performance. The city remained a place of contrasts: mercy and spectacle, commerce and conscience. But it was less willing to allow cruelty to pass as culture without contest. In the end, that relentless, quiet contest proved to be as decisive as any trumpet on the day of a show.